Hello, webinar attendees. My name is Marisol Morales, and I serve as the Vice President for Network Leadership with Campus Compact. We're so happy to have you be part of the second year of the Campus Compact National Webinar Series. And today's webinar is titled Decolonizing Approaches to Inclusive Discussions and Trainings, Lessons from Indigenous Perspectives, with our wonderful and talented presenters who I'll be introducing shortly. There are a few things that I want to plug in the Compact Nation feature. One is our national biweekly podcast series that's hosted by President of Campus Compact, Andrew Seligson, Director of Iowa and Minnesota Campus Compact, Emily Shields, and myself. I hope you have a chance to check out our newest podcast that we released earlier with Dr. Jose Calderon, who's Professor Emeritus at Pitzer College, where he talks about his journey as a activist scholar. And it's just a wonderful conversation with Jose Calderon. In addition, I wanted to also plug that today is the last day for early bird pricing for the Campus Compact National Conference that's taking place in Seattle, March 28th through April 1st. So make sure you get those early bird prices. In addition, you probably received information about the Impact Awards. This is our first awards that we're having, and including community engagement professionals. So we have the Nadine Cruz Award for Community Engagement Professionals, the Richard Carassi Award for four-year institutions, and the Eduardo Padron Award for two-year community colleges. So please check out our website, compact.org, to find out more about our conference, the podcasts, as well as our Impact Awards. In addition to that, nominations are open for the Newman Civic Fellows, so please check those out as well. At this time, I'd like to introduce our presenters. First, I'd like to introduce Lori Walker. Lori is an associate professor at the University of Montana. Lori worked as a community organizer in after-school programs in treatment centers and with college student leadership development and student clubs prior to becoming a professor. Lori's current work with the ACLU seeks to address discipline and achievement disparities for minority population in Montana's public primary and secondary schools. Lori was awarded the Association of Community Organization and Social Administration Emerging Scholar Award in 2014, and was also an award recipient for the Ernest A. Linton Award for Scholarship of Engagement in 2017, and the Nancy Borgman Diversity Award in 2019. Lori regularly trains on integrated frameworks for entering and exiting community partnerships that includes decolonizing approaches to engagement. Our next presenter is Turquoise DeVoe, and she is an independent consultant with a Bachelor's of Social Work from the University of Montana and Master's of Social Work from Arizona State University. Turquoise is a first-gen arrangement in the Salish and Blackfeet tribes in Montana. Turquoise works with students and institutions on resiliency, diversity, equity, inclusion, and trauma-informed approaches to support Native American, low-income, and first-generation high school and college achievement in rural and urban settings. Turquoise works at the intersection of direct support to students, conducting organizational process consulting, program evaluation, and training for school staff, teachers, faculty, administrators, and community members in tribal and non-tribal educational settings. Turquoise earned the Montana Indian Education Association's American Indian Support Staff of the Year Award in 2017. Thanks you both for this really important webinar, and we're excited to get started.
All right. Thanks for having us. Okay, thank you all for being here today. We want to start today by doing a land acknowledgement. So the land that me and Lori are currently on was originally Indigenous land, and this is one of the statements that the University of Montana uses. So the University of Montana acknowledges that we are in the Aboriginal territories of the Salish and Kalispel people. Today we honor the path that they have always shown us in caring for this place for the generations to come. And we do want to acknowledge too that Salish and Kalispel people might, like including myself, be here with us today. And this is a picture of the Salish people who were in the land before the university was built. And they give me the pride and privilege to be here speaking to you because they are my ancestors.
So we want to talk a little bit about why we do land acknowledgements. Um, and Marisol was going to put up a poll, I believe, as well, asking some questions about these. But some of the practice that's becoming more commonplace, we want to just get a sense of your own familiarity with this if you'll do a quick poll and answer these 3 questions. All right, so we have the results here. This is helpful for us to know as we move forward. So it looks like 14% have never really heard of a land acknowledgement. So what Turquoise just did may have been the first time you've seen this done. 58% have observed but are not very familiar with them. And 29% have developed and implemented land acknowledgements in their areas.
Yeah, so the second question, if people know the Indigenous people who historically occupy the land that you work, about 63% of you said yes, and then about 30% of you said no. So that lets us know too that that's actually really great that 63% of you know. And then the third one, are you aware of the Indigenous people in your community currently? It actually was the same exact ratio, 63 yes and 37 no. That might have a direct mirror results in that. So that's really great to know as well.
So it's great to know that both groups are in the audience, and we'll take a little bit of time to explain, for those of you who don't know, how to identify who has been on your land, whose ancestral territories might be on your campus or in the community where you work and live. There's a website. Just Google native land. It pulls up a map and you can put in the town where you are, and it will help you learn some of that history. And some of what we haven't been doing as much of in recent years is explaining why we do those. The reason why I do land acknowledgements is because it is a way of centering Indigenous knowledge in the present, in a way of being honest about our history with colonialism in the places where we work. And so if I start, and now I have it on my syllabus, our president of our university starts graduation, other often events. I've seen him do it more often than not recently when he's speaking publicly. It just changes the way that the table is set for that event. It's a way of acknowledging, for example, that we have treaty relationships with Indigenous people in the places that we're working. My understanding is that all of those treaty relationships have been broken on the US government side. And so by doing a land acknowledgement, we're acknowledging that this is a space where we can know that those things are true and a part of our present and a part of our past, and start our conversations that way, which completely shifts the dynamic of whose knowledge and experience is centered in that space. We're both here locally in Montana have done work with our Campus Compact office that is statewide in terms of coming and doing trainings. So I'll have Turquoise talk a little bit about the trainings you've done with our Campus Compact office.
Yeah, so when because I got my undergrad here at the University of Montana, and then I worked here for a couple of years, primarily not just with Indian Education for All, but really trying to create culturally safe spaces for Native students and Native populations here in Montana. So the training that I did with Montana Campus Compact was I did the training that I do currently now to a lot of different organizations and populations is around historical and intergenerational trauma of Native Americans, and really how to utilize that information or that knowledge that we don't necessarily learn about in our education system to really have a true understanding of the reality of our Native communities and how to move forward when serving Native communities and using that education in a way where you're serving Native populations with very accurate, culturally accurate services, and also being trauma informed.
And then as a member in past years of our Service Learning Advisory Board and a faculty member on campus, I also go to quarterly trainings, often at the beginning and the end of our AmeriCorps Vistas and other AmeriCorps, and as well as the staff of the Campus Compact office, to do some basic sharing of the knowledge that we're going to share with you today, to make sure that when we have people moving into Montana from all around the country, that they have some awareness that they're coming into a state with a high percentage of Indigenous populations. They're often out serving in reservation contexts, to just raise their awareness and start the conversation and give them some tools at the beginning of the year, which they can then use to process and connect with each other throughout the year, to lean in and learn as humble cross-cultural learners, and then come back at the end of the year and help them debrief and think about how to terminate and end those relationships in a way that honors those reciprocal relationships with the communities that they're in as well.
I think it's also really important to, I guess, understanding that people who aren't from Montana, who are part of this, who are attending this webinar, is that in Montana, Indian Education for All is actually a state mandate. It's in our state constitution. And so here, you know, it's, especially in our education system, it's acknowledged that it's important to include cultural curriculum, but also understand that having that culture within our schools is really important for our Native populations. And so that was really what supported a lot of the work that I did around, you know, creating culturally safe classrooms for Native students.
So as our local Montana Campus Compact office has brought Turquoise in first, then myself with Ivan MacDonald, one of our Blackfeet students and a filmmaker and employee of the Urban Indian Health Center as a clinician here in Missoula, we would come and do these trainings, and then often they'd be prepared and ready for additional trainings. So then we've connected them with our Indian Education for All office, and individuals like Mike Jetty, who developed curriculum for the state for primary and secondary schools, then are also interacting with our volunteers and employees here in our Campus Compact office.
So when we think about this idea of not just Indian Education for All, but decolonizing spaces, and these are directly come from Indian Education for All and the Montana Office of Public Instruction, there's 7 essential understandings. And so the first, you know, is understanding that there is a lot of diversity among tribal communities, even though sometimes, like for instance, I come from the Flathead Indian tribe here in Montana, and we have 3 tribes, the Salish, Kootenai, and Pondere on our reservation. Salish and Pondere, they speak, you know, they both speak Salish, so they're pretty similar. But Kootenai and Salish, they're completely different, even though we reside on the same reservation. So the perfect example, they have a totally different language, they have totally different ceremonies and things like that. And so one thing to really understand is that there is diversity. And when you generalize populations, it has some negative impacts on, you know, really not only acknowledging that they're diverse, but them being able to, with their identity of who they are as Native people. And then when you think of, you know, even the ideologies of Native traditional beliefs and spirituality, that they persist, and they're still a big part of the way that we live as Native American people, but also they should be included within the American education system, and understanding that it's still alive and today, and especially giving tribute to our Native communities that still are in our states and in our nation is extremely important. And that the beliefs and spirituality of Native people is just as valid as Westernized education, I think is really important. So also that for reservation and tribal communities, we have really our own, in our communities, we have our own sovereignty, and that's really important for us to make our own decisions about our communities, and that's something to understand. And we also have to understand how historical events and federal policies still continue to shape our experiences as Native people. So on this slide, we do have kind of timelines of when things happened, but we do have to understand is even though these have end dates, I feel like that's a very linear and westernized way of thinking of historical impact, because due, just the studies of historical trauma and intergenerational trauma, even, it's this impact, it's this idea that this impact continues to have, to display outcomes within our communities today, and still has a big, I guess it plays a big role sometimes in modern day tribal communities. And especially the self-determination period that we have here, in a sense, to the present, because that's really tribal communities really taking control and trying to take that power back, and that's really important to understand. And then, of course, history told from Indigenous perspective, it frequently conflicts with the mainstream history that we learn, and a lot of the work that I've been involved in is really telling that history from an Indigenous perspective. And the fact that we don't learn it, and if we continue to not learn it through Indigenous perspective, then we're continuing to perpetuate oppression against Native American communities. So really acknowledging that that history and the accurate history from the Indigenous, the original people who were here before European contact, is extremely, extremely important, especially when you're thinking about decolonizing spaces. And then, of course, the sovereign powers, like I mentioned, we're separate and independent from federal and state governments. So a lot of times tribal communities have the sovereignty to either work just with the federal government and we can bypass state things, but you just have to understand that we're our own entity in sense of government.
And I just wanted to add some of the diversity as well to be aware of is Indigenous groups that are recognized by the state or federal government and that are not. You may hear about the Little Shell from Montana in Washington, who have been fighting to get federal recognition for decades. Other groups like the Lumbee in North Carolina, I've been learning about myself because I'm always trying to learn and grow and in terms of gaining new information and awareness. Often have complicated stories. The second to last bullet point talking about history from a written record conflicting with the stories that people tell about their own communities. If you go back and look at census records, you'll see a misidentification of people by race with the census takers compared to how they identify themselves. And they have a unique situation, as one more example, of being federally recognized but not having access to federal funding in their communities. So just being aware of people who have varying levels of recognition and then various levels of negotiation with the federal government that often have strong histories of variations of how those injustices play out.
One more thing about diversity too, like you're saying, not only with federal and state recognition, but also with historical impact, because of how colonization happened throughout our country and where it happened and things like that. Different tribes throughout the nation have different experiences with that. And so we have to also recognize that there's diversity in experiences as well.
So we want to talk a little bit about one of the trainings that I do when I come in the beginning of the year with our Campus Compact volunteers in the state of Montana. It's a game that I was able to participate in when I was an undergraduate student that stuck with me. I was just re-explaining this to Turquoise last night, that it was a card game that they played with us where we basically are playing a game of rummy. But each table in the room has slightly different rules. How you score, whether a face card is worth 10, or whether you count a 3 as 3 or 5 points, whether there are aces, whether there are jokers, how those are used. And so I set it up so that I pass out the rules and have each table learn the rules, then they play, and then have people rotate between the tables based on whether they have the highest or lowest score. And so then people end up at a table with a slightly different set of rules, but they're not allowed to verbally talk or write. They can only use nonverbal cues and play the game. But there's an expectation that they're supposed to interact a little bit and confirm their scores by maybe writing out their score as 15 and someone saying, no, that should be 13, without being able to speak to try to communicate that. And so it ends up building some interesting emotions while people are playing the game. Typically, when I do this with our Montana Campus Compact community, people will get a little bit emotional. They'll be, generally pretty quiet and reserved. They might giggle a little bit, but they might look around and be confused. but often they don't get the punchline of the game during the game. It's often in the debrief that we end up explaining. And I've done this training probably 15 or 20 times at this point, and that's how it always goes. But when I came and did the training with the Upward Bound staff at the University of Montana, who last summer were 100% Native American in terms of the staffing, except for one long-term staffer who's also worked for the Campus Compact office, who's white. They had a very different experience, and Turquoise was in that training.
Yeah, so, well, I'm like an avid rummy player. So I granted in the beginning, rummy is definitely something I enjoy. But the rules that I ended up with in the beginning were actually very similar to how I play. So I was like, oh, I got this. Like, I'm going to do so great. And what ended up happening was, because each table got different rules, and because we couldn't talk when we would switch, I found myself, especially because I played rummy so much in my life, that I was, no matter what someone would tell me on a different table of what I was doing wrong, I would just still do what I was doing. And it was really interesting because for me, like I noticed that people were saying, we couldn't talk, but we were looking at each other like, no, like you can't, like you're doing it wrong, or you can't do that. And what ended up happening when we could talk was that
people were also non-verbally communicating. So
yeah.
I think it was Shelby who I saw being like non-verbally being like, that's not how we did it over there. Like you could tell really clearly that she was able to say this table is operating in a really different way than that table was.
Yeah. So it's really interesting because then when we ended, we were all like super like upset, not really upset, but we all kind of knew what was going on. And we figured it out. We figured out that we all got different rules. And so we ended up being like, oh, well, who won? And what's kind of even funnier is the only white staff, she was the one who ended up winning. So then we accused Lori of partnering with this white staff, because Lori's also white, and they had this connection. And so it was a joke, but I mean, it's just so happened that she ended up winning. But we instantly figured it out. And I didn't know Lori's perspective of always doing this game and this not being a result, because for us, it was so easy for us to think like, navigating this game was like, we figured it out. We figured out that we had different rules and that we had to make it work, right? But yeah, knowing Lori's experiences of doing it, and that was the first time anyone ever came up with the whole concept in itself, like during the game, was really, really interesting.
And what was interesting about that was the Upward Bound staff were preparing to bring students from Browning, Montana. I think there's maybe some people from Blackfeet Community College. A little shout out to them here today. Some students from Browning that may attend BCC or other schools in the state like ours get the opportunity to come down and take summer classes while in high school. And and so they were preparing to kind of help them navigate and manage the cross-cultural experience of coming from Browning or schools here in Missoula and living on campus and trying out being college students for the summer.
Yeah, and I think from my perspective, especially having my experience working with a lot of Native students, is really, a lot of the work that I've done is really helping Native students navigate both worlds of coming from an Indigenous worldview, but having to be successful in this education world of a Westernized worldview. And really, I think because especially a lot of us who are in that group playing that game, we have had to do the same things in our life, especially because all of us either were in school or we had finished school at that point. And so, being in this simple game really showed our skills of navigating and figuring out how our environments really help us function. And even in that small of a setting, is we're able to figure it out, because in our lives, we don't have a choice. We have to figure it out if we want to be successful. And especially in education. And so I think that was a perfect example of thinking of this different worldviews and understanding how especially Native students function within higher education and any education in general.
So at that point with the Campus Compact group, I would typically teach them about how to pay attention to that dissonance that they're going to feel when they're out in a reservation community for the first time and things are being done a little bit differently, coaching them on things like things are different, there's not right, there's not wrong, your perspective and your understanding, often from a colonial perspective, is not the way to do things, and coaching them on how to build relationships and stay connected and lean in those moments when they have their own frustration because of cultural differences. And so I'm teaching them those skills, but when I was doing the Upward Bound training, we had to skip to a completely different conversation where we acknowledge that living in two worlds and navigating in those spaces. I typically have three punchlines of that. The first is kind of teaching them what it feels like in their body when they have those cross-cultural experiences that are dissonant for them, and then how to cope and relate in ways that are helpful both for their communities and their organizations they're partnering with, but also for their own self and community care in those contexts as well. And then the second thing that we talk about is this idea of social empathy, and how for a lot of our Campus Compact volunteers out in the communities across the state, they spend their year immersed in the community, developing empathy, understanding the experiences and the stories out in the communities. And often by the end of the year, they're asking more of the bigger picture questions about, well, why is this? And this one thing really annoyed me about this, the way it played out in my organization, but we often have to help them process and understand the structural and systemic barriers. And honestly, even when we were meeting with the Campus Compact staff, who are very open and wanting to learn about these concepts, they would often share things in their reflections that Ivan McDonald would have to jump in and say, okay, your understanding of trash in the community and blowing around on the reservation and your desire for cleanliness and your assumptions about how that came to be are actually not rooted in a structural understanding of the problem. What you don't know is that there aren't trash services that regularly come to the communities. And he would explain some of those extra layers of the systemic barriers that even the staff in the office weren't understanding. And so some of what we do in that training is try to help them pay attention to what they feel, but empathize, then situate it in a structural understanding of the problems, then build relationships in a way where they've got those perspectives from others. And then eventually, once they have all of that working together, they can finally figure out, well, how do I work on this and collaborate in a way that creates a socially just outcome?
Yeah, and I think the perspective of coming from like an Indigenous worldview, and a lot of populations of color, when you come from these collectivist communities, right? And sometimes when you think of a collectivist community, sometimes you think like every individual decision that you make, you think about your family and your community needs as well. And so when you look at this diagram, I think you are already in that mind state of understanding that there are barriers. And when you think about Native students going in higher education, it's a perfect example because I always use the example of, Native students, usually when they go into higher education, most often they usually do a helping profession or something that they can then use those skills to return to their community to help better their community. And so it's just in our values and our belief system and coming from the community we were raised in that those are some of our life goals and our career goals. And that really plays out in even in social justice, right? Because when you think about even just lived experiences, right, which play a huge part in that mindset as well, and the way that you're raised in your community, you're already understanding those contextual, like systemic barriers, and you live it and you see it. And so the idea of social justice is already part of your decisions that you make, going into making decisions for yourself, but also ultimately making decisions to better your community. And that's an idea of social justice. So I think it's really important to acknowledge how life experience also plays a huge part and worldview in the idea of social justice.
So some of the work that I do in my social work classroom, and this is rooted from a scholar in Canada, an Indigenous scholar, is help students understand their own worldview, their own motivations, their own agenda, and thinking about, I often have to help non-Native students become aware that they even have a worldview and that exists. I often do that through stories. Fire, through this citation here, has a story about a duck that is a narrative story that is a great place to help people understand their immediate gut reaction to what they should do to help in this situation. And whether someone is very focused on an individual in therapy or paying attention to the larger structural systematic issues that are happening in that story is a good starting place. Honestly, in our social work program here, the more we have followed through on the challenges from Turquoise Devereaux and President Carla Bird from Blackfeet Community College, who did her dissertation here, and others, the more we develop our curriculum in a way where we're helping people be aware of Indian Child Welfare Act through additional coursework, and do decolonizing and critical action research content in our classes. Our students start working harder on those case examples in a way where they actually don't respond often from their first gut reaction in what their worldview is, the way they did in the past when I've used these examples. But now they're somewhat more aware in trying to think critically and try to think about, what do I think the right answer is here from a critical perspective. But it takes a lot of work. They may get it in that case example, but by the time they sit down to write their paper with their research methods, I still find often their worldview about what they think is virtuous or deviant is still coming strongly from a colonial perspective. And I often have to help them decenter their own voice as much as they have good intentions to try to think about and write about it from centering Indigenous ways of knowing and being, because these projects are out trying to address issues like suicide on the Flathead Reservation, for example.
Yeah, and I think understanding worldview too in these spaces is extremely important, because when you think about the idea of worldview, it really supports even the way you think culturally, right? And so it has an impact on your individual culture, the culture that your people, that the group that you belong to, how they function. So it comes down to you and making your life decisions, but then also it can create a barrier sometimes in helping populations that you don't necessarily belong to. And so this idea of worldview and growing up on a reservation in a tribal community, this is something that, especially if you're living off the reservation or you're going to school off the reservation, this is something that you automatically understand. Because it sometimes, a lot of students, when they would come here and it was their first time off the reservation, sometimes it was a culture shock and it was a completely different experience than what they would experience at home. And so this idea of worldview, it really isn't just the way people think, but it literally comes down to how people make their decisions and sometimes why they make their decisions. So it's important to be conscious of that when you're in these spaces. So this is an event that actually happened here at the university. Was this last year?
I believe it was last spring.
Okay, last
Or,
spring.
sorry, maybe the spring before, but within the last year or so.
Okay, so this is really awesome. I wasn't here for this, but a lot of my students that I worked with before I moved to Arizona were a part of this and helped organize this, and are in some of these pictures. But I think these pictures, and Lori can talk about a little bit more because you were there. Were you there?
Yeah.
Okay, awesome. So one thing I think that's really important to understand is when you think about Indigenous worldview, we really come from these beliefs and values, like I was saying, of collectivist communities. And so we really understand how being together and having a really strong support system is really, really important. Especially when you look at research with even Native students, right? It's it shows that if you can provide identity and embrace identity and provide support networks for students, they actually will be more successful in higher education. And so this is a perfect example of that. Some Native students, they organized this event and it turned out absolutely amazing. I just remember listening to, talking to my students after this night, and I called it, and they're so happy and it turned out so amazing. And so this is actually a round dance. And so round dances happen, and it's a very simple dance that we do. You hold hands. It's really a community dance, and it's really meant for that community aspect of being with each other and you're dancing. And it's not hard to do, so really anybody can really do it if you have the ability to. And even if people have a hard time, you're being supported by each other, and you can, as you can see, some of them are really, really close together. And so I remember this summer we did round dances with our kids with Upward Bound, and I hurt my knee this summer, unfortunately. And even though I had a really bad hurt knee, they'd grab each side of me, and I would still be able to do it because being part of it, I think, was extremely important. So this is really great. And the round dance, in our community is really, it just really exemplifies that supportive network, and it's meant for a community interaction. I think this is a perfect example of that.
Cool. And we just had a chat box comment come up from Claire Foley, who's been through the card game training that we were talking about, saying that this was a part of the Campus Compact 25th anniversary celebrations, as well as the Board of Regents meeting. And she said that it's beautiful and has videos of the event as well, and that the students did a fantastic job. And so you can see our university president in these pictures. You can see one of Turquoise's mentees, who's now writing for our local campus newspaper, leading our powwow, and our first ever Student Diversity Advisory Council co-chair, as well as our Montana Campus Compact director, and we had the president of Montana Campus Compact here as well. And the way we've been talking about this event that evening is that it is a picture of inclusive excellence. This idea of getting people together and centering, in this case, Indigenous ways of knowing and being, which then built community in a way that our Board of Regents, our powwow faculty, our staff advisor was saying she's never seen some of the Board of Regents interact in those ways. And he also had a knee injury that day, and she came up and said, no, this is something you can do. We've got you. Come participate. And it's building community on our campus in a way that we hadn't seen before. So it was fun to see that play out. And I see our Campus Compact staff here also saying Andrew was there at the event, that you can see him here. So, and then Carla's also weighing in from Blackfeet Community College, saying amazing job with this as well. So thanks y'all for filling in parts of the story with us as people who also witnessed this. The last thing I wanted to say on this slide is that the building of a democratic culture, which is part of this inclusive excellence and part of Campus Compact's missions to get people engaged in voting and involved in political processes. We believe that these moments of centering Indigenous students, staff, and faculty's ways of knowing and being community together will help us build this kind of community here on campus.
Yeah, so again, a lot of the work that I do is really education around understanding how to decolonize classroom settings, especially, and kind of undoing that, you know, the things that a colonial mindset and kind of the things that it's perpetuated against Indigenous populations in the past, and kind of really just trying to undo some of those things within the classroom, especially because, you know, education, Native students and Indigenous populations really deserve equal access to education, just like any other population. And sometimes the experiences that students experience in classrooms add barriers, and they actually sometimes cause students to not finish education due to those experiences. And so when we think about really decolonizing the classroom, you know, the first category is centering Indigenous and minority perspectives. So that's really understanding and acknowledging that Indigenous education is just, like I mentioned before, as valid as a Westernized education, and those mindsets and those beliefs and that worldview is really important. And it's really important to incorporate that into the classroom. You know, and really creating, I call it culturally safe spaces for students to really teach people how they identify and what, you know, and especially in Native or Indigenous culture, but then also being able to build relationships where they really feel safe. And that that means also having relevant curriculum, and a lot of times cultural curriculum. And so really having curriculum that is accurate to our culture, but then also, you know, utilizing local tribal resources is a thing. I did a lot of work with our education department here at the University of Montana, because we have Indian Education for All, and it's expected for our educators to include cultural curriculum in our K through 12 settings, is, you know, really providing them with education behind why this is important, but then also encouraging them to reach out to the local tribal communities, and also, you know, having a knowledge base strong enough where they feel comfortable educating their students on Indian Education for All without committing things like cultural appropriation. And that really has a lot to do with the students then feeling safe and seeing themselves within the curriculum and within their classroom and having that representation, because that's extremely, extremely important to for the success of our communities in the future, is being able to see ourselves in those spaces. And then addressing microaggressions is huge. A lot of the research I did in my undergrad here at the university was really working with Native students on campus on what their experiences were in the classroom. And a lot of the results from that, you know, came from them being tokenized and invalidated, but also just small microaggressions in the classrooms that really sometimes came from the lack of education from professors or staff here on campus. And so addressing those and being able to understand that there's an emotional process that goes along with microaggressions. And sometimes students, if they don't have the support or they don't have safe spaces to work through those, then they they might not be successful in higher education or in education in general. And so that's really important to acknowledge. And also you want to lessen those, right? So understanding that it's important to be educated, but then also understand these concepts of what are the things I can do within the classroom to really alleviate the microaggressions that happen.
The last thing I wanted to add as an instructor is, even though I may have an understanding of how to do community engaged decolonizing research, it doesn't mean that every single one of my classes have this in place. For example, when Turquoise was in my small groups and communities class, there was a time where she was saying, what does any of this have to do in terms of relevance to my growing up on the Flathead Reservation? And so it's taken me quite a bit of time to actually go and unlearn the way that I've been taught how to teach these classes and how to rebuild my curriculum in a way that does center Indigenous and minority. And I know minority is a word that people are choosing not to use as much anymore. So I'll update this slide in the future, but decolonizing many different ways of knowing and being and different identities in the classroom.
And I think that's a perfect example because I would, at that point in my education, in my higher education, my undergrad, I was at a point then when I met Lori and I was in that class of, I was at the point where I said, what I'm learning, translating it to the community I want to serve is just a big thing to do that I don't necessarily know if I can do that. And so, you know, Lori really taking that into account and then changing the classroom in that way honestly kept me in my educational or on my educational journey.
And for those of you who are wondering if these, we got a message asking this, if the slides will be available online, they will be posted online as well as this video.
So when we think about decolonizing the classroom setting and this idea of really incorporating Indigenous knowledge and acknowledging Indigenous peoples and really alleviating those barriers to getting education for Native American populations and Indigenous populations, you know, there's some really awesome outcomes that come out from that. But really what, when I was here and really focusing on the actual experience of Native students, when you think about Native students in general, you know, persistence is a huge factor of Native students. So on average, you know, have a longer average length of time for undergraduates, about 7 years versus 4 to 6. I personally took 6.5 years for my undergrad, and I actually didn't take a break. Sometimes I do part-time, but that shows you right there. And you know, the average Native student is actually, would you say, not the typical, but is usually a non-traditional single mother. And so the fact that I don't have children and, you know, and I wasn't considered a non-traditional student and it still took me 6.5 years shows right there that there's a lot of things that go into Native students' higher education journey that can have an effect on that. And so some of the research that I did, you know, the 4 things that I really wanted to focus on with Native students, really to, you know, not just embrace what they're experiencing and help them through that, but also understand what keeps them on this journey in higher education. And so the 4 topics that I really worked on when I did my focus group in my undergrad, the first was stereotype threat, meaning that when students hear negative stereotypes about the population they come from, it actually ends up affecting them to the extent where their academic success is lower. And so it's kind of a threat on who they are. And then tokenism, microaggressions. And it was interesting when I did these focus groups with Native students, because the idea of microaggressions, I made sure to explain each topic before I had them sit down and write their experiences down. But with microaggressions in general, because I've been doing this work, I assumed, right, I made an assumption that they knew what microaggressions were. And it was really interesting because even though I laid out the definition of it, when I sat at the focus group table to make sure that they understood what we were asking for, they actually didn't understand the extent of microaggressions, or something that's so small that has a huge effect on somebody that was considered a microaggression, right? They were just thinking of these big things, like maybe things that were like completely blatant, like racism, versus small things that still have a huge impact. And so I think it was really important. And I'm so glad I was able to be part of that process, because acknowledging those small things that still have a huge impact is just as valid as anything else. Also, the fourth thing that I really wanted to focus on, and I think this was mainly because I wanted to come from a strength perspective of what keeps students in higher education, and it's the resiliency factors. And when I was doing my analysis of my data, I made sure to do the resiliency factors last, because for me, even as a Native student and then doing my work, it was the most incredible things I've ever read. And honestly, that's what kept me motivated to really work through my higher education, even till this day, because, thinking about those resiliency factors, and the Native students that I worked with were so resilient. And I think that was really, really important to understand, and really understand where they get those things from. So even as me, when I worked for American Indian Student Services, I could help embrace those ways of how they identify, and then the factors that they use to make it through higher education.
Some of what I wanted to add from this slide here as well is that Turquoise conducting research as an undergraduate student as part of her internship, or what we call a practicum in social work, was beyond what was expected for that level of curriculum. And yet, as she's able to kind of see a real problem and then work beyond what people would expect is possible of an undergraduate student, not just in conducting the research in a really decolonizing manner, in a way that is culturally safe for the students, but also in terms of the impact. This information ended up getting disseminated to our academic officers, our president, our provost, all the deans. You've probably done this training 50 or more times.
Yeah.
On campus and classrooms around the state. And it has also resulted in students owning some of those stories in a collective way, and then our Native American Student Advisory Council actually getting our faculty senate to change the way that we handle cultural leave, so that students have permission to go to ceremonies that aren't necessarily scheduled based on a calendar, but sometimes based on the first thunder strike or other things in the environment that cue it's time to go and be in ceremony, as well as the need for leave to go in. Often when our students are dropping out or stopping out, as Dr. Bird I think would say, it's not just for their own medical care, but to also go care for family members.
Mm-hmm.
Or I regularly have, in this semester, every semester I've had particular Native students in my class, they've had 2 or more funerals that semester that have an impact on top of anything else that they might be juggling personally. And so this work has been decolonizing in the sense that the creators of the knowledge are Native students. We've been doing these trainings together. When I say on here, doing trainings with undergraduate students, that was Turquoise as an undergrad student, now a master's trained individual who does this for a living
Mm-hmm.
as a consultant now. And so, so I want to say that the fruit of doing just a little bit of decolonizing work, even though the classroom where we met, I wasn't doing this yet, just a little bit of water on a seed can grow into so much structural change, and in this case, a career that you've launched.
And I think I also too want to mention, using examples from what we've talked about previously in this session, is the idea of really being in a space where you have to translate what you're learning to serve your community. And Lori, when I was working through this process, how Lori was saying that me collecting data was something that wasn't really expected. But for me, that was my passion of serving the population I came from. And so me just coming from this worldview of like social justice already and what I wanted to do passionately, but then also Lori helped me in that process of translating what I was doing into academic terms, so I understood, in educational wise, that I was already doing this. It's just in these terms that are expected of me in a westernized education. So that was a really great way that Lori decolonized the way that I thought too with my education.
I think for the sake of time, I won't go over this, but I'll just briefly say that this process here is something that I found is useful. If you're still trying to figure out what is a microaggression, we didn't explain that a lot, so you can go and Google that term, find Sue and other articles who really articulate that in a helpful manner and really concrete way. And then this process here is typical. A Native student or an LGBT student or whoever it might be in your classroom or your colleagues, every time some sort of accidental, unintentional invalidation of identity or other harm that might happen in that moment, they've often go through this whole process to try to make sense of it. Did it happen? If it did, what did it mean? What do I do about it? And it's often a years-long process. to try to unpack those and try to move through them. And we've got students now on campus who are really effectively moving through those, and we've been reflecting this week on when they're moving and kind of creating these systemic change within our system. Some of the hardest part is that in that empathy slide that we had earlier, that emotional regulation, just remaining calm and cool and collected to kind of channel that cold anger about whatever it was that happened, to try to create some sort of change so that another student doesn't experience that same thing in that same way.
Yeah.
So the last thing I think that we'll say before we open it up for questions is that we've been using on our campus the 6 or 7 R's as a way of understanding how to center Indigenous values and ways of being together. And so again, we don't have a lot of time to go through all of these, but I regularly find myself trying to remember each of these in this moment. Are there students represented at this table? Are we being responsible and responsive is the 7th one that I've been adding recently as an institution to the things we're hearing. Is it relational? Is it relevant, respectful, and reciprocal?
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think going off of the previous slide where you talk about that emotional process that you go through, especially when you experience things, this is a perfect example of, you know, if you create spaces with these things within it, it alleviates that for students to go through that process, because sometimes that process can literally be a reason for them to not make it through education. And so really centering around this Indigenous worldview and values is extremely important, and having all of these things incorporated. And like Lori said, you know, really checking yourself to make sure that you're incorporating these things and it's actively and it's acknowledged, I think is extremely, extremely important when working with Indigenous students.
So we want to open it up to your questions, your comments. You can type those into the question and answer section of Zoom. And with the little bit of time that we have left, we might have time for 1 or 2 questions before Marisol needs to wrap us up for the day.
I think while we wait for questions, if you want to continue with some of what you have.
That's what I was thinking too. So the other thing that we wanted to talk a little bit about is how many of our campuses have community engagement offices, have Campus Compact in our communities that are working with us on doing community engaged work more generally. And then we often have diversity offices, chief diversity officers and staff that work on those issues on our campus, for example, American Indian Student Services. But often they're siloed and separated. And some of what I've been challenged by with some of my mentors, like John Saltmarsh from Massachusetts, is trying to develop an integrated framework, which is our attempt of what we're doing here today, that names power, positionality, these systemic causes of disparities, the need for institutional changes, and critiquing the ways that we go about doing our work and what we know. So some of my career at this point has been getting behind students and kind of using my community organizing skills to create space for them to center their own ways of knowing and own ways of being, which has honestly resulted in a lot of really beautiful products in terms of documentary films focused on issues like missing and murdered Indigenous women, and other topics like that that have come out of group projects in the classroom just by being somewhat intentional. And I'm not talking about drastically redesigning my curriculum, but even like little moments here and there that make space have turned into these results. Let me take that. Where do you want me to?
You can start now.
Okay. So one question that we got on the chat box is, how would you recommend bringing knowledge and openness to learn in an environment with no Indigenous people? And my first thought is there probably are Indigenous people there, but you might just not know who they are. I know I have colleagues in my department that started around the same time as me who said they'd never seen a Native American person. And I just had a conversation this morning with a student who said that same person said to them they'd never known a transgender person. But I know for a fact there were transgender students in their classroom. And I know for a fact there have been many Native American students in their classroom. So The first thing is maybe checking the assumption that there aren't Indigenous people. And then my second thought is maybe start by looking at the land acknowledgement and the people who were there and historically before colonization and what those stories are. And then eventually that might lead you to the living contemporary Indigenous people who are there.
Yeah, and I think too, understanding the concept of, you know, coming from as a Native American woman and then also, you know, being Indigenous, I get asked the question a lot when I work with, especially at a systematic level, of like, well, if we incorporate this cultural curriculum, then we're only acknowledging Native culture, right? But really, this idea of decolonizing a space and incorporating culture and those types of things that we're talking about really gives a lot of empowerment to other cultures as well, especially other people of color and other Indigenous people that might be in the classroom that you don't even know they're there. And so it can create this energy and this culturally safe space for them to really understand that they're okay to then identify with who they identify or with what they identify with, and then also just really taking the education in a totally different setting of where they know how they can translate the education they're learning to the community they want to serve.
I'm not able to get to the Q&A. Is there another important thing that we should address in the Q&A?
So in the Q&A, it's asking if folks will have access to the references presented in the slide, and you're showing that right now. And then just a kudos in terms of the help with brainstorming that the presentation provided to folks.
Cool. And then the last challenge that I always like to leave you with is how can you take some of this information, even if the question you're asking yourself is, are there Indigenous people where I am? That might be the thing that you can take from this to go and apply. But for each of you, regardless of what context you're in, if you're on a campus or in a community, tribal community, what is it from what we shared that you can think about and perhaps implement in your context is the question you want to leave you with.
Yeah, and I think too, understanding the different levels, right, of kind of the work you can implement, or even with yourself. I think just, you know, basic, like even like empathy skills of like self-reflection and understand how, you know, things that you learn about, especially with Indigenous populations, how that makes you feel and why, and how you can utilize those emotions to really build empathy and lead to social justice. But also within even tribal communities, you know, understanding this, I think it helps with a lot of, it can help with a lot of validation, but then also just knowing how to support your fellow Indigenous people, I think is extremely important. And knowing that there's people out there that do this work and that are really passionate about creating equal access to education for Native students.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I just want to thank you both for sharing this. And it's such an important aspect to our work that I think as Campus Compact and our community engagement offices are looking to be more relevant to students, the ways that we implement and bring in different ways of knowing is so important for us moving forward to create the kind of democracy that we're looking for. And this introduction to this work was so important. So thank you both for the work that you do on your campuses, with your communities, and with us in sharing this knowledge and helping us think about these decolonization processes. As someone who comes from a colonized nation, I appreciate how you all framed this and the important work of an acknowledgement as a first step towards healing and repairing harm. So thank you so much. I want to thank our attendees for participating in our webinar, and again, the panelists. Please look out for the evaluation survey that will be in your inbox shortly. This webinar, as well as the slides, will be available on the Campus Compact website where you signed up for this. And until next time, thank you.